Conversation about the economy, how we got to where we are with the economy, including concerns over inflation, where the economy is going, and what it says about both our political and economic systems. My guest for this conversation is Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis is co-founder of DM25, which is a democracy in Europe movement. He is the former finance minister of Greece. He's the author of a number of books, including Talking to My Daughter, A Brief History of Capitalism. He joins us from Athens. Yanis Varoufakis, it is a great pleasure to welcome you back to this radio program.
It's always good to be back. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. You became the finance minister of Greece in 2015 after a popular movement in Greece arose to oppose deep austerity that was being forced upon Greece by the international community. Eventually, you would resign because the government gave in to the international community in some ways anyways. And that was a product of the Great Recession that goes back 2008 or so. How would you relate what the global economy and what we're all going through today compared to that period of time when you became Greek finance minister?
I am in a very small minority of people who do not believe that this is a new crisis. To answer your question directly, I think that what happened in Wall Street in the fall of 2008 was a major rupture in the foundations of global financialized capitalism, US capitalism and global capitalism. And that rupture unleashed a tsunami of a crisis, which has been circumnavigating the globe, taking different forms, different shapes, in the same way that, climate change takes different shapes. You can have, forest fires in Siberia and flooding in the deserts of Australia. One is fire, the other is water, but it's the same crisis, the same phenomenon, it's the same explanation of what's going on. Similarly, you can have periods of serious deflation, falling prices, falling wages in nominal terms. You can have the subprime catastrophe that started all that in 2008 in your neck of the woods. You can have a period of inflation now, but it's the same crisis that began in 2008. So, I really detest hearing people say, what do you think about this new crisis? It's not a new crisis. The old crisis, the one that started in 2008, which in my book, in my estimation, it's our generation's 1929. The moment Wall Street collapsed in 1929, it wasn't a small crisis of the stock exchange, it was a major crash. Nothing was the same after 1929. The world changed completely after 1929. Similarly, our 1929, 2008 changed everything. And now what we're seeing is a new phase of the same crisis that began in 2008 that takes the form of increasing prices and cost of living. But it's not that different. I mean, if your wage stagnates, as it did in the United States after the 1970s, especially after 2008, your wage stagnates. The goods and services that you're supposed to buy will become more sophisticated. You have iPhones, you have the other, but you can't buy them because your wage has stagnated. Why is this so different to having a situation where everything is going up, but prices are going up much faster than your wage and you're squeezed? It's exactly the same kind of phenomenon from a personal perspective. In terms of the dynamics of the capitalist, the system that we live in, of course, it's a different phase, and we need to take into consideration those differences. But I insist, it is the same crisis.
When we hear the causes that are driving inflation, we hear about people talk about the pandemic, supply chain backlogs, higher wages, the war in Ukraine, price gouging, and government spending. I saw a recent article that you wrote in which you said it's all of these things and it's none of these things. And that quote, you write this: pivotal economic crises frequently evoke multiple explanations that are all correct while missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
What is the point?
Well, I'll try to answer as succinctly as I can, but the argument I'm putting forward in that article and now is that all the things that you mentioned, the interruption of the supply chain due to the pandemic, the federal government expenditure, assistance to households, especially the unemployed, the war in Ukraine, all these are absolutely correct. I mean, they all played their role, but the way they've come together to bring about the phenomenon needs to be explained at a higher level of abstraction. And here it is. What is that higher level of abstraction? In 2008, I go back to 2008, we had our 1929 moment, with one exception. That is, one thing happened in 2008 which did not happen under President Herbert Hoover in 1929. You'll recall that in 1929, Hoover let the banks go. He let them collapse. They shut down. I mean, that spearheaded an even greater depression and negative dynamic, but they let the banks go. In 2008, they didn't let the banks go. They had learned the lesson, in inverted commas, of 1929, and Hank Paulson, on behalf of W, and then, of course, Larry Summers and Tim Geithner on behalf of President Obama, they, together with the central banks of the G7, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Sweden, the Bank of Switzerland, and so on, they printed something like between $15 and $18 trillion in the space of a few months, in one way or another, by which to refloat finance. So the bankers were saved. They were bailed out. Not just the banks, the bankers. This huge quantity of money, we're talking about a gigantic quantity of money, public money, that was injected into the financial system to save it. It's a kind of socialism for the bankers. Was accompanied with harsh austerity for everybody else. In America, you have this touching belief that Obama introduced a stimulus program. He did not know such thing, because the stimulus program at the federal level was undone at the state level. If the states were doing very harsh austerity, they were cutting and cutting and cutting because they were bankrupt, more or less. So even though the federal government was doing a little bit of stimulus, the overall macro fiscal policy of the United States was austerity. So you had austerity in the United States. You had huge austerity in the European continent, and Greece is the champion of austerity. We had the greatest austerity in the history of capitalism. You had austerity in Germany. You had austerity in Britain. You had austerity, in the developed world, the capitalist world. So if you combine this, largesse, socialist in inverted commas, largesse for the financiers, Wall Street going up and up and up and up the way. Even during the pandemic, you had exactly the same thing. The pandemic simply exacerbated that. They printed more money and gave it to the bankers, and the bankers supposedly would lend it to people and so on. But in the end, that money ended up in Wall Street, share buybacks. So you had Jeff Bezos losing sight of the humongous wealth mountain that he owned. So you have this huge liquidity on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have a dearth of spending power by the many, austerity for the many. Now, what that does is this: if you're very rich and you're an industrialist, and you have no problem in dealing with this situation because the Fed, the ECB, and so on, they've been printing money and giving it to you through various channels, but it ends up in your pocket or in your wealth account, right? But even if you want to invest in producing goodies for the people out there, you look at the people out there, and what you see is billions, millions or billions, if you look at it globally, of impecunious austerity hit people. And you think, if I'm going to invest in a good quality green car, let's say, many more Teslas, whatever, they won't be able to buy it. Look at them. They're wallowing in misery. Austerity has hit them very hard. So what you do is you don't invest. So, from 2009 to 2021, we had this complete disconnect. We had the greatest amount of money sloshing around in the financial circuits of capitalism, especially in the United States, your neck of the woods, and you had the lowest level of investment compared to the amount of money around. That's a major failure. major failure. But also what it does is it depresses interest rates. So it wasn't the fault of the Fed that it kept interest rates low. You need to think of the interest rate as the price of money. You need to think of liquidity as the supply of money. You need to think of investment as the demand for money. So when supply, take potatoes, right? When you've got a huge supply of potatoes and very low demand for potatoes, what happens to the price of potatoes? It keeps falling. Now, the difference is in the case of potatoes, if the price keeps falling, people will buy potatoes in the end. With money, money is a very crazy commodity. It doesn't happen with money because it's industrialists that need to invest. No? You and I cannot really invest. We cannot create a production line to make stuff. Elon Musk can. But when they see that the price of money, which is the interest rate, falls to zero and then keeps falling below zero, no? They don't see, great. They don't think this means that the price of money, the price of investment is going down, let me invest more. What they think is, for the Federal Reserve to be pushing interest rates so low, so close to zero, things must be really shitty. So I'm not going to invest. So imagine a market for potatoes where there is an oversupply, excess supply of potatoes, the price of potatoes comes down, and the ones who, the buyers are staying away because the price is coming down. This is how crazy the financial markets have been for the last 13 years. So this explains why you had negative interest rates in Europe and very low interest rates in the Fed. Don't blame the Fed for that. It's simply a reflection of the failure of capitalism in 2008 and the way in which politicians, co-opted by big business and Wall Street in particular, created socialism for the financiers and austerity for everybody else. That was a situation when the pandemic hit. The pandemic made the bad thing worse. So they printed even more money and it was even less investment. Okay? Then, with the first vaccines and so on, we start exiting lockdowns. Okay. Now, by that time, of course, all the ships, all the vessels, seafaring vessels, had been stuck in the wrong ports. So all the container ships and the LNG ships that had started from China or Qatar, bringing goodies to Los Angeles, let's say, or to Rotterdam in Europe, they came, they didn't stop in the middle of the ocean, they unloaded the stuff, and they got stuck there. So when the governments pressed the button to restart the economy, all the ships were in the wrong place. So they had to go all the way back to China to bring more stuff. They had to go to Qatar to bring more LNG, right? And have I got stuck? Can you still hear me?
Yeah. For a moment we were stuck, but I could hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll backtrack a bit. So all the ships were stuck in the wrong ports, and the supply chains were severely interrupted, which means that the costs of transport went up, the cost of energy went up. All that in an environment which was flush with cash of the rich, and some of it had gone to the poor in furlough wages and support for unemployed people and so on. Meanwhile, because we had 13 years of very low investment, the capacity of American industry, of European industry to produce had shrunk. 13 years of not investing does that. So supply of goods had fallen for 13 years, not just due to the supply chains. Money was out there, flowing like it never had done before, right? And then naturally, the first increases in energy and transport costs allows the Walmarts of the world, the monopolists of the world, in other words, the companies that had already taken a big share of the markets and therefore, could charge whatever they wanted. They had the capacity. When the price of transportation or energy went up by 5%, they could pass this on to the consumer by charging 10% more for the final good. So this is where the consumer gouging, price gouging comes in. But you've got to understand this in the context of what happened in 2008, the liquidity that was provided by socialism for the bankers, the austerity for the masses. This was a great, if you want, misdeed. I was going to say crime, but I don't want to use such charged language of the Obama administration. For me, Trump is a result of Obama. Obama created Trump. as a result of these policies, austerity for the many, socialism for the few. Because when you do that, you have a depressive situation, and depression and the deflation always begets monsters, like in the mid-war period. And so we are now in a situation where inflation took off, another kind of austerity. It is another kind of austerity because it means that the working class simply needs to shrink their consumer power, their capacity to buy stuff. I think that the difference with the 1970s is that this inflation is transitory. I do believe that it's already ebbing. But even when it goes to 0 or 2%, the target of the Federal Reserve, even when that happens, the level of prices, it will stop going further up, but it will stabilize at a very high level when wages will have stabilized at a much lower level. So again, you have a big shift of income and wealth from the have-nots to the haves, a trickle-up effect, so to speak. This is more or less how I see the world. So, okay, in summary, all these explanations that you mentioned in the introduction are correct, but the real beast that explains the feel that we get wherever we look at around the world is the 2008 crisis, which interrupted a process of financialization and globalization by bankrupting the banks, a bankruptcy to which the administration in Washington, but also in Europe, responded by applying socialist principles for the banking sector and huge austerity for everybody else.
In 2008, when all this money was going to the financial institutions, could the government had said, you must invest with this money rather than hoarding it, and would have that made a difference?
Absolutely. But you can't just say that because, you go to Mr. Diamond or whoever happens to be, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and you tell them something, you say, yeah, right, okay, bye, good night now. What you need to do is expropriate them. Expropriate them. You can't, listen, if you're running a business in any other sector of the economy and you go bankrupt, you lose your business. You go home, you lose it. That's it. You don't go to prison anymore. We don't have debtors' prisons in the 21st century, but you lose the business. It shuts down. It's, bankruptcy is to capitalism that which hell is to Christianity. Unpleasant, but it's how the system works, right? But what happened here was this. These people blew up their banks through corrupt, toxic, unwise, irrational behavior that jeopardized the well-being of millions, if not billions of people. And what happens is they're salvaged. Where is the story about moral hazard and all that? What should have happened is very simple. The government should say, okay, these are special businesses. Bank of America is not like, the local corner store. If the local corner store dies, there is no systemic risk. If Bank of America dies and people lose their savings and confidence and so on, it's a big systemic thing. Okay, so the state has to come in and save Bank of America, but not save the shareholders, not the CEO, not the board of directors. These people should be wiped out, thrown out. The state takes it over, takes the Bank of America or Citigroup or whatever, takes it over, bears terms, appoints a new board of directors with very specific instructions on what to do with the money, the public money that is used to save those banks, like investment, for instance. And then, if you are of a liberal disposition, not American liberal, you know what I mean, conservative in your terms, disposition, and you don't believe in nationalized banks, okay, sell it later on, but to new owners, so that those who own banks know that if they blow them up, if they bankrupt them, they're out. They're not going to be salvaged. And there's a very strong precedent there. In 1992, those old enough to remember will recall that all the Scandinavian banks went bankrupt. In Sweden, in Denmark, in Norway, in Finland, they went bankrupt. And what the Scandinavians did, the Scandinavian government, was exactly that. They saved the banks. They got rid of they wiped out the shareholders. If you're a shareholder of a company that's gone bankrupt, that's it. You lose your shares. It's part of the game. They took them over, nationalized them, kept them under public ownership for 2 years, directed them towards investment, and then after that sold them. And, you can go, there's another example too, 1998, South Korea. All the banks went bankrupt, all of them. Then the government came in, got rid of the bankers, nationalized them, fixed them, sold them again. Now, if that had happened in 2008, 2009, then today we would be in a very different and far better world.
I found it interesting when you told me that, sure, things would have been different if the banks in 2008 were told, and in the years following, were told to invest the money that they were getting from the federal government, but that would never happen. Of course, you've been in the room with these people as former Greek finance minister. You've had your own sort of requests and dealings with these folks. I mean, you know this firsthand.
I do, and you know what? It's uncanny and particularly disconcerting that behind closed doors, those very same people admit it. They confess freely that what I just told you was the right thing. So some people say to me, Yanis, hang on, you're so narcissistic and, so up yourself. This is what friends tell me, that I'm up myself. You think that you know best and everybody else doesn't know what they're talking about. And I say to them, look, this is not at all the case. Behind closed doors, when I was talking to those people, I was talking to the people from the International Monetary Fund, from Goldman Sachs, from Lazard, the French investment bank, from Deutsche Bank. They all agreed. But they said, what are we going to do? When they come to bail us out, are we going to say no? And even when it came to poor little bankrupt Greece, I was putting forward technically, I think quite sophisticated solutions to the bankruptcy of the Greek state. And I was saying to them, look, no more credit cards. It's crazy to roll over the debt by getting one credit card after the other to keep supposedly repaying our previous debt using new credit cards. This is something that only a moron does. And I was proposing ways of restructuring the debt. And they were coming to me. Even Christine Lagarde, who is now the president of the European Central Bank and who was then the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. And she said to me, Yanis, you're absolutely right. This is what we should do. But we can't do it because our institutions have invested so much in doing the other thing. And she meant the bailing out of the bankers. And your political career or credibility, I think she said, depends on you accepting this and going along with it. I said, I don't give a damn about my political career and political credibility. I was elected to end this crime against logic and against humanity. The result is that 6 months later, they managed to divide our government. My prime minister and former friend surrendered to them, and I resigned. Not because I'm a good guy, but because, I don't care enough about politics to stay in office in order to do stupid things that crush my soul.
Has Greece ever recovered?
Well, why don't you look at the data and work it out for yourself? I'll simply report it for the benefit of our audience. When I was in the finance ministry, and Greece was in the news all the time, as a bankrupt state, blah, 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 blah. Our debt, I won't give you zeros because zeros are confusing. Our debt was 305. Say 300, okay? Our debt now is 400, okay? Our income back then was 170, it's 170 now. So we have the same income and we have, instead of 300, 400 billion euros debt. So we are more bankrupt than ever. But you don't hear it. This is not in the news now. And allow me to explain why it is not in the news. Because they managed to defeat the Greek people. The Greek people voted in a referendum to say no to these, to this extending and pretending of the crisis through new credit cards. We were crushed. My party and my government was divided. As I said, I resigned. The rest stayed on to do as they were told. ever since, this is a place on a fire sale. On a fire sale. A German company bought all our airports. Can you imagine it? They bought all our airports for the majestic sum of zero. I mean, the former price was $1.5 billion, but they didn't pay it. They borrowed it from the Greek state. It's a bit like me coming to your home saying, I like your house. This is a nice house. I'm taking it. And you will lend me the money to buy it from you. How would you feel if I did that? And it's not just the airports, it's the ports, it's the railways. Everything has been sold. Nature, beaches, beautiful beaches. So as long as we have governments that are saving Greece by doing as they are told, they keep refinancing our debt. They keep giving us more credit cards, which effectively is just IOUs issued by central banks. But in the meantime, there are business people from the United States, lots of funds which are domiciled in the great state of Delaware, as you would imagine, or the Cayman Islands, who come here and purchase stressed debt, private debt, mortgages, for 3% of their price. And then they push people out of their homes. If they sell the house a little bit more than what they paid for it, they make 100% profit, which then they take to Delaware or to the Cayman Islands, leaving nothing but a wreck behind them. So, as long as they can do that, as long as the plunder continues, Greece is not in the news. And if you read the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Greece is doing well because it's, we can refinance that. We sell debt, that is, we borrow more at very low interest rates because the central bank is covering it on condition of the continuing fire sale. And the worst aspect, and here's where I'm going to stop talking about Greece, the worst aspect is, of course, we're losing our young, the best educated young Greek girls and boys leaving the country because there's no prospect for them. And this is a kind of capital that is irreplaceable. I'll just give you one statistic. In the last 10 years, we've lost 60% of graduates from medical schools. So effectively, this poor country is spending an arm and a leg to train doctors who then offer their services all over the world, but not to the Greeks.
You're investing in them, but then they go, and that investment's being used elsewhere.
Yeah.
So everything's being privatized in Greece.
Either privatized and sold, indeed, without any significant investment. But this is you have lots of Greeces within the United States. Greece is a small place, but you have lots of Greeces in the United States, the wastelands that are being created, which unfortunately always give rise not to a revolutionary fervor, a left-wing progressive one. What it gives rise is to the Donald Trumps of the world, who go to the downbeaten people, especially the older ones, whose grandkids or children have migrated, or who are in the process of migrating, or who have accepted to stay in miserable conditions, doing precarious jobs in an Amazon warehouse or equivalent. And they say, I'm going to make you proud again. Make me a dictator, and I will make you proud again. This is how Mussolini rose to power. This is how Donald Trump rose to power. This is how this cabal running Greece today is in power. Then about to start another war with Turkey to distract people from their circumstances.
In the pandemic, many governments did start putting some money into the masses, sort of contrary to what we saw in 2008 with the money just going to the financial institutions. Did this help balance this dynamic that we've been talking about, or did it exacerbate the problem?
Well, look, it was a good thing that they supported people who lost their jobs during the lockdown. I'm all for it. Even if you give $1 to somebody who needs it, who's just lost their jobs, I'm never going to say, I'm not going to look down upon it. But it did exacerbate the problem. It exacerbated the problem because in the end, all it did was, at the macro level now, to start the process of inflation, which caused the ones who kept their jobs or went back to their jobs to fall behind again in terms of their power to, not to consume so much, I don't care about consumption, but to put food on the table and, to pay school fees and, medical fees and all that. In the end, this was not the end of austerity. It was the beginning of a new kind of austerity. The furlough wages and the support of the unemployed. It was politically essential. They could not do it because, when you say to people, you're not allowed to go to work. You're going to have to stay in the flat in your apartment, right? I mean, it makes sense to say, and we'll give you some money to buy food. But this was not really going ever to end the austerian dynamic that started in 2008. It just gave it another twirl.
Yeah. And in austerity in the sense of driving inflation forward. It was interesting what you just said. If you kept your job during the pandemic, you really fell behind because you're probably still very close to the same wages that you were earning pre-pandemic.
Absolutely. There's some uptick in U.S. wages. I've been looking at your data, but it's nowhere near the increase in prices. So people on minimum wages in the United States are suffering a severe diminution of their social conditions and their capacity to reproduce themselves as human beings.
You mentioned the 1970s earlier, and you have written about Paul Volcker, who was the U.S. Federal Reserve Chair in the 1970s, and we had what was called the Volcker shock. Earlier, when you mentioned the 1970s, you indicated that we're not quite in the same situation today as we were in the 1970s. But what do you think is important to know about the inflation of the 1970s and Paul Volcker?
Well, Paul Volcker was a very complicated and interesting man. I'm not a fan of Paul Volcker, but I think that he was, we haven't seen an intellect like his, at least not in the Fed, at least not in Washington, D.C., in the last 30, 40 years. I was mightily impressed by two interventions by Paul Volcker. One was very early. He was a very young man. He was responding to Henry Kissinger, who put the right question to the people that were working for him, and one of them was Paul Volcker, or with him, back before Kissinger became Secretary of State, when he was still at the National Security Council. Because Kissinger, smart man, even though I consider him to be a war criminal, but that's neither here nor there. He could see that the United States was going into a deficit, a trade deficit and a budget deficit. And he, being a student of international hegemonic power relations, he was worried. He said that every time a great power goes into deficit, very soon after that, it's no longer great. So how are we going to remain hegemonic, given that we now have a deficit? And Paul Volcker back then said, well, we're going to have to make the deficit larger and make other people pay for it. The rest of the world pay for it, which is exactly what has been happening since he became chairman of the Federal Reserve, with a huge increase in interest rates, which was justified to the American public as a price that they had to pay in order to snuff out inflation, which it did snuff out inflation. But Volcker had a bigger plan. And it wasn't just his. There were very smart people in the American administration. Their plan was really very simple. When you are facing an increasing deficit, trade deficit and budget deficit, there are two things you can do. You can do the German thing, which is to tighten your belt, to austerity, right? So maybe you reduce your income, maybe you reduce your expenditure, but that way you balance the books again and the deficit goes away. Washington decided, no, we're not doing that. Damn that. And Nixon put it very, very bluntly. He said, I'm not going to push the American people through a recession just to balance the books. So the alternative is to make other people, to increase the deficit and make other people pay for it. So between the time when Paul Volcker took over the reins of the Fed, and by the time he had left, we had the second phase of the post-war era. In the first phase, Bretton Woods, between 1950 and 1971, the United States was a surplus country. It had surplus. It was selling more to Europe and Japan than it was buying from them. And the money that the surplus was being made, it was judiciously using it in a hegemonic way to support Europe and Japan. Think of the Marshall Aid Plan, think of the way in which the Japanese industry was totally supported by the United States. I mean, people in Detroit, I keep telling them that it was Washington that decided to destroy the car industry on behalf of the Japanese industry. Why did they want to do that? Because they had this global plan of the United States dollar being the center of gravity of the global system, but having Japan and Germany being two pylons that supported the dollar zone. And then, therefore, they needed strong industry. So the Japanese industry and German industry had to be supported. And this was a genuine plan. But that simply could no longer continue once America was no longer the surplus country. So once it became the deficit country, people like Paul Volcker said, okay, what we need to do now is we need to turn America into a huge vacuum cleaner, sucking into its territory, into our territory, from his perspective, your perspective, the net exports of Germany, Japan, and later China, creating globalization, making the Japanese, the Chinese, the German factories work at full capacity. We absorb all this stuff. We consume it in America. Okay, so we import all the stuff from them. Okay, we have a big deficit, but who pays for it? Deficit. The Germans, the Japanese, and the Chinese. Why? Because those capitalists, they will need to store their profits somewhere. Where are they going to put it? They're going to put it in the US Treasuries and Wall Street. So that's the tsunami of capital that was coming following the net export, all the Mercedes-Benzes and all the Chinese products and the Japanese gadgets that were coming to them to America were also followed by 70%, more or less, of the profits of Asian and European capitalists. So this was a fantastic, an amazing and mind-boggling recycling mechanism. And Volcker was at the center of that. And the whole thing blew up in 2008. That's why I'm saying 2008 was an important moment, a pivotal historic moment. The reason why it blew up was because on the back of this tsunami of profits coming from Europe and Japan and China into Wall Street created all sorts of paper money, private money, CDOs, DSs, CDO squares, and so on. So, you give a Wall Street banker $1 billion to play with for 10 minutes, they find ways of making $3 billion through wagering it. And, they created something like $750 trillion worth of fake money, effectively, which crashed and burned in 2008. And that brought us to where we are. So we need to understand Volcker's role, or the role of the 1970s. And one last thing, because I think that is important. I know I'm talking a lot. My daughter tells me this all the time.
That's why we have you on.
The difference with the 1970s inflation, however, and the reason why I'm not worried about inflation now, I'm worried about inequality, I'm worried about recession, I'm worried about toxic politics, right-wing politics, Trumpism, and so on. But I'm not worried about hyperinflation. Why? Because in 1971, part of the Volcker plan, and Kissinger's plan, if you want. And you remember that guy Connolly, who used to be Treasury Secretary, a Democrat friend of LBJ, who turned and became the Secretary, the Treasury Secretary under Nixon. John Connolly, I believe was his name. These were the people who decided that the way to cut America's debt to the rest of the world due to the deficits during the Vietnam War, the late 60s and so on, was to have a massive depreciation of the dollar. So they broke up in 1971 the Bretton Woods system. They decoupled the American dollar from gold. They decoupled the American dollar from the Deutschmark, from the Japanese yen, from British sterling. They allowed it to devalue. Suddenly, all the debts of the United States were effectively gone. They were haircut. They were devalued. But that created hyperinflation. Why? Because the Arab mainly Arab oil exporters, they wanted to be paid for their every barrel of oil in gold equivalent. So when the US dollar changed, it used to be $35 to an ounce of gold, then went up to 100. Then, of course, Saudi Arabia and the rest were asking for a lot more dollars for every barrel of oil. And that created a massive depreciation of the dollar, as well as of the purchasing power of people's money in their pockets. And at the time, the trade unions were still quite strong. They could push wages almost as fast as prices upwards, sometimes faster. General Motors workers were getting 15% pay rise when inflation was 12. That is no longer the case. I mean, look at the struggles to set up a union in an Amazon warehouse. I mean, it happens. Chris Smalls, to his credit, did it in New Jersey, and we're celebrating, but it's in one little warehouse. This is not going to happen again. So we need to understand the connection with the Volcker era, and we need to understand the differences from the Volcker era.
You mentioned the things that you're concerned about: recession, politics, and equality. Are you concerned about democracy and how democracy works in this? Is this a crisis for democracy now?
This is a bit like asking, is there a crisis in the state of breathable air on the moon? There's no crisis of breathable air on the moon. There's no air on the moon. There's no such thing as democracy. We have a very brutal, ruthless oligarchy that occasionally holds elections in order to legitimize itself. That's what we have. And whenever an election or a ballot ends up coming up with a verdict that the oligarchy didn't like, it gets annulled. I mean, here we were elected back in 2015, and then there was a referendum. We took to the people the ultimatum that was presented to us by our bankers. They gave us an ultimatum. So we took it to the people and said, let's have a referendum. Do you want to accept it or not? And all the media were screaming into people's ears and, living rooms, don't you dare say no to the ultimatum. Don't you dare. It will be Armageddon. It will be, you'll go back to the Paleolithic age. Every television channel. And 62% of the people didn't listen to them and voted no. And that very same night, the no became a yes. So as a friend of mine used to say when we were very young and not that stupid, he said that, if elections could change anything, they would be banned. And, here in Greece, we have experienced that. We experienced in 1967, we had the CIA-backed coup that annulled elections. In 2015, we had another coup using the banks, not the tanks, by which democracy was annulled. In the United States, you have no democracy. Look at the way in which Bernie Sanders was treated by his own party. I mean, that primary was stolen from him in 2016. I have no doubt about that. Hillary Clinton and the NDC and all that. Democracy is a fantastic ideal that we need to struggle for. We don't have it.
Do you see a recession on the horizon?
Oh, definitely. Already, the vast majority of people are living in recessionary times. They're already, it's not, I don't need to predict it. They're already, I remember when, who was it? Obama was campaigning around, I don't remember which state, and he was saying to some people that had gathered, some workers, that, you shouldn't complain, GDP is going up. And one of the workers stood up and he said, your GDP may be going up, mine isn't. So the GDP of the vast majority of the United States now is shrinking in real terms as we speak. So we are already in a recession. But, we haven't really come out of it since 2008. And even before 2008, it was a fake growth period because it was all done on unsustainable debt. Remember the subprime? Remember all that irrational exuberance over lending people were sinking in debt, and their nominal income was rising, but their debt was rising even faster. And then once the bubble burst, they lost their houses, they lost their jobs, they lost everything. So, the end of Bretton Woods that I described earlier in 1971 was the end of the American and the European dream, the dream that, my children are going to have a better time than I did, and their children will have a better time than they will. That's gone. The working class in the United States, the working class in Germany, the working class in Europe, well, they were better off 15 years ago. And it's impossible to look at our children and to imagine that they will have a life as good or bad as ours. Theirs is going to be worse. And if you throw into the equation climate change and the destruction we are wreaking upon the planet, then, the whole thing gets rather stark on our radar screen.
Right now, we are seeing the Biden administration here in the United States beginning to make more oil from federal lands available. Is this a moment in which we are, not that we've ever really tackled issues around climate change, but is this a dangerous moment and not only not doing anything, but potentially exacerbating the problem?
You will recall that towards the end of last year, the great and the good, including Biden, gathered in Glasgow, in Scotland, for so-called COP26, which was supposed to be the pivotal moment during which humanity takes a step back from the brink of climate catastrophe. They failed to do it. They didn't even manage to agree on basic things like net zero, which is not the solution, net zero, as far as I'm concerned, but at least it was their goal. They failed by their own criteria. The fossil fuel industry managed to undermine any agreement. They used India, they used Saudi Arabia, they used Australia, they used segments of the American administration, and they effectively undermined the agreement that humanity should have reached back in the end of 2021. Since then, we had the war in Ukraine, which has been a new excuse by the same fossil fuel industry to not only fail to reach an agreement that would save humanity, but essentially to maximize the pace at which we are poisoning the planet. Biden is going to go down in history as, amongst other things, a president who became the lackey of the fossil fuel industry, and he allowed the fossil fuel industry to use the war in Ukraine as an excuse for damaging the planet irreparably. I know that some people, in good conscience, will say to me, but Yanis, look, we need to heat up our homes. We need to power industry. There is a crisis in the world energy markets. We need to forget about the long-term targets for a bit, because there is an urgent energy crisis today. Rubbish. Those lands that Biden is making available for drilling are not going to produce gas, usable gas or usable oil for another 10 years. So it's not a short-term fix. It's a long-term bloody disaster. If in 10 years we have not managed to extricate ourselves from fossil fuels, we are a stupid virus that deserves to die on the face of this planet. So if it was a question of, we have a tap, we just, unscrew it in order to have more energy today where we have a problem, I would understand. It's not what they are developments that are going to be detrimental to our capacity to breathe on this planet. And not solving the short-term energy problem due to the Ukraine war either. And if you look at, just, you don't need to take my word for it. Look at all the windmills, wind power in Texas. You have a lot of it now in Texas. I used to live there. And I remember it back then, and I hear there's a lot more of it now. Now, take every kilowatt hour produced by this thing going around and around and around in circles in Texas. The marginal cost of producing that kilowatt hour is zero. Zero. Doesn't cost you anything. The wind is free and it moves this thing around and around, and a kilowatt hour comes out. And yet you are paying for it as if it was produced by the most expensive LNG. Need I say more? It's a scam.
Yanis Varoufakis has been our guest. Again, Yanis Varoufakis is the co-founder of DiEM25, Democracy in Europe Movement. He's a former finance minister of Greece, and he is the author of a number of books, including Talking to My Daughter, A Brief History of Capitalism. Yanis Varoufakis, I thank you dearly.
It was a great pleasure.